My name is Hazel Blackwood, and I've lived in this small town of Mapleton for over 50 years now. Most folks around here know me as the kind old lady who brings peach cobbler to church potlucks and never misses a Sunday service. They see me rocking on my porch, waving to passers-by, tending to my garden full of daisies and lavender, and they think they know my story. But honey, they don't know a thing about what happened behind closed doors all those years ago. I'm 72 years old now, and the weight of the secret I've carried for more than half a century has pressed down on my chest like a stone I couldn't move. Some nights, when the wind howls through the maple trees outside my window and the moon hangs low over the hills, I sit in my rocking chair surrounded by the porcelain dolls my grandchildren have given me over the years, and I remember every detail of that terrible time when I wasn't much more than a frightened child thrown into a world of men with no choice but to survive. Today, I'm finally ready to tell the whole truth. What happened when my father sold me like cattle to Dr. Ezekiel Montgomery, the tortured-looking man who became my husband, and how God worked in ways I never could have imagined. This story needs to be told, not just for me, but for all those who have ever felt trapped with no way out. So come with me, walk with me through these memories that still make my old heart race. Help me carry this tale that has weighed too heavily on my soul. Growing up in the rural outskirts of Willow Creek, Tennessee, in the late 1960s, wasn't anything like the world young people know today. Back then, a girl's future wasn't her own. It belonged first to her father and then to whatever man he decided to hand her over to. I was 17 years old, still playing with the rag dolls my mother had made me when I wasn't helping with the laundry. My entire life was decided over a cup of coffee and a handshake that I wasn't even allowed to witness. My father, Jeremiah Blackwood, was a hard man, worn down by years of trying to make a living from stubborn land. We lived on a small plot about 3 miles from Willow Creek, in a house that leaked when it rained and creaked like old bones when the wind blew. My mother, Ida, spent most of her days coughing into her handkerchief, a cough that never left her chest after my little brother died of tuberculosis. Back then, I had dreams. Silly, perhaps, but they were mine. I wanted to work at the general store in town, save up to buy one of those pretty dresses I'd seen in the Sears catalog. I was sweet on Wesley Thorne, a boy 4 years older who worked at the neighboring Hawkins farm. He had gentle hands and a smile that gave me butterflies in my stomach. We would meet sometimes by the old oak tree that marked the boundary of our land and talk about getting married someday when he could afford his own piece of land. But I was naive to think my feelings mattered. Our farm was falling apart, and my father owed money half the county. That summer, the drought ruined nearly all our crops, and the bankman started coming with papers that turned Pa's face red with rage. That's when Dr. Ezekiel Montgomery began appearing at our dinner table. Dr. Montgomery was a prosperous man, the only physician in Willow Creek County, with a large estate on the hill overlooking the town. A widower, they said. Rumors were that his first wife had vanished years ago, just up and left him one day. At 52, he was older than my own father. When he looked at me across our kitchen table, there was something in his pale blue eyes that raised goosebumps on my skin, like he was measuring me for something I didn't understand. The first time he came, I thought he was there to do business with Pa, maybe buy some of our land. I served him coffee and Mama's good china and tried to make myself invisible, but I could feel his gaze following me around the kitchen like a shadow. It was Mama who told me the truth, in a quiet voice while we folded laundry one humid August afternoon. "Hazel, Your pa has made arrangements for your future. Dr. Montgomery has asked for your hand, and your father has given his blessing." The sheet I was holding fell from my hands as if my entire world had crashed to the floor. "But Mama," I whispered, "what about Wesley? What about what I want?" She couldn't look at me when she answered, "What we want doesn't matter when there are bills to pay. Your father says it's the only way not to lose everything." That night, I snuck out to meet Wesley by our oak tree one last time. When I told him what was happening, he held me so tight I could barely breathe, and I felt his tears mixing with mine on my cheeks. He promised he would find a way to stop it, that he'd ask his boss for an advance, but deep down, we both knew the truth. In our world, a man's word was law, and once hands were shaken, there was no going back. I was going to become Mrs. Ezekiel Montgomery, whether I wanted to or not. The wedding was set for September 15th. 3 weeks to say goodbye to everything I knew and deigned of. 3 weeks before I would share a bed with a man whose mere presence made me feel like my skin wanted to crawl away from my bones. Watching the acceptance papers on the table like a death sentence, I knew my childhood was over. I was no longer Hazel Blackwood. I was being passed from one man to another like a piece of furniture or a milk cow. I had no idea then that my wedding night would be just the beginning of a story so strange and terrible that even now I sometimes wonder if it wasn't just a nightmare from which I never woke up. The 3 weeks before the wedding crawled by like molasses in January. Each morning I woke hoping it had all been a bad dream, but there was Dr. Montgomery, punctual as a clock, bringing gifts I hadn't asked for and talking with Pa as if I didn't exist. He brought me hair ribbons in colors I didn't like and peppermint candies that tasted like false promises. The way he watched me eat them, those pale blue eyes fixed on my mouth, turned my stomach. He wasn't an ugly man, I must admit that. Tall, with broad shoulders, silver threads running through his dark hair, and hands that looked like they'd never done a day's labor. Though folks said he ran the most successful medical practice in 3 counties, he always dressed impeccably and smelled of expensive soap and something else, a sharp medicinal odor that reminded me of the doctor's office. But what unsettled me most was his voice. He spoke softly and carefully, as if handling something fragile, but beneath that apparent gentleness was something else. Something that raised the hairs on my skin whenever he said my name. "Hazel," he pronounced it as if savoring it, as if I already belonged to him. The strangest thing was how he sometimes stopped mid-sentence and stared at nothing. His face would go blank, like someone had blown out a candle behind his eyes. Then he'd shake his head and return to the conversation. But those moments left me with the feeling I'd glimpsed something I shouldn't have. One afternoon, a week before the wedding, Dr. Montgomery asked Pa to let me take a walk with him around the property. Pa agreed without hesitation. By then, he would have agreed to just about anything. We walked in silence, my feet crunching over dried corn stalks, until we reached the fence that marked the boundary with the Hawkins farm where Wesley worked. There, Dr. Montgomery stopped and looked at me with those pale eyes. "Hazel," he said in a different tone, softer but more intense, "I want you to know that I understand this arrangement may not be what you would have chosen." I was so surprised he admitted it that I looked directly at him, instead of lowering my eyes as Mama had taught me. There was something almost vulnerable in his expression, as if he wanted to tell me something important but didn't know how. "But I want you to know," he continued, touching my cheek with surprisingly soft fingers, "that I'm going to take care of you. You'll want for nothing as my wife. You'll have a beautiful home, pretty dresses, anything your heart desires." What I wanted to say was that my heart desired Wesley Thorne and a life I could choose for myself, but instead I just nodded and murmured, "Yes, sir." Then he did something that froze my blood. He smiled. For the first time since I'd known him, he smiled for real. And in that instant, his face changed completely, but it wasn't a kind or happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just obtained something he'd wanted for a very long time. "There's just one thing I need you to understand, Hazel," he said, still touching my face. "Once you're my wife, you belong to me completely, not to your parents, not to anyone who might have filled your head with silly notions, only to me. Do you understand?" I nodded again, but the way he said belong chilled my blood. He didn't seem to be talking about marriage, but about ownership, pure and simple. On the way back to the house, Dr. Montgomery seemed more relaxed, even humming a melody, but as we passed by the Hawkins farm, he turned his head to look at the fields with an expression I couldn't decipher. Later I would realize that what I saw on his face was recognition, as if he knew something about that place and the people who lived there that he had never shared. That night, as I lay in my narrow bed listening to Mama's cough through the thin walls, I tried to convince myself that perhaps marriage to Dr. Montgomery wouldn't be so terrible. Maybe he really would take care of me as he promised. Maybe I could learn to be content with pretty dresses and a big house, even if my heart was elsewhere. But in the deepest part of me, in that corner where the soul whispers truths you don't want to hear, I knew that Dr. Montgomery was hiding something dark behind his careful words and false smiles. I had no idea how dark it was, nor how deep it all went beyond a simple arrangement between two men. I didn't know that before the week was out, I would discover the real reason Dr. Montgomery wanted to marry me, and it had nothing to do with loneliness or desire. It had everything to do with a secret he'd been keeping for 20 years, and a debt he intended to pay by making me his wife. I had no idea that my wedding night would be the least of my worries. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that strange look Dr. Montgomery had given the Hawkins farm, and I felt something like a splinter I couldn't remove. Around midnight, when the house was silent except for Paz snoring and Mama's occasional cough, I got up and peered through the kitchen window that faced the road. That's when I saw something that changed everything. A figure was walking up the dirt path in the moonlight, and even from a distance I knew it was Wesley Thorne. My heart leaped, thinking maybe he'd found a way to stop the wedding, but as he got closer, I noticed something was wrong. He was walking strangely, stumbling. When he reached the porch, I saw blood on his shirt. I opened the door quietly, still in my nightgown, and went out. Wesley looked at me with frightened eyes, and I saw a deep cut above his left eyebrow, still bleeding. He told me that 3 men had attacked him on his way home, beaten him, and warned him to stay away from me and my family. But the worst part was that one of them mentioned Dr. Montgomery by name, saying I was already spoken for, and Wesley would be wise to forget about me. I felt a chill like creek water in winter. Dr. Montgomery had sent men to hurt him. This wasn't just about Paz's debts or a business arrangement. Dr. Montgomery wanted me, and he was willing to use violence to ensure he got me. But there was more. Wesley took my trembling hands and told me something that left me weak. One of the men, while beating him, had let slip a comment about Dr. Montgomery's first wife, Vivian. She hadn't run off as everyone believed. According to what Wesley heard, she had tried to leave him, and bad things had happened to those who tried to help her. The tremor in Wesley's voice told me he wasn't just worried about himself, but about me. He begged me to run away with him that very night, saying we could reach his cousin's place in Kentucky before anyone noticed we were gone. For a moment, standing there in the moonlight, with blood on the boy I loved and terror in my heart, I was about to say yes, but then I thought of Mama's worsening cough, Pa's hunched shoulders, and the bank papers on the kitchen table. If I left, Montgomery would withdraw his offer, and my family would lose everything. They could end up homeless, and Mama was too sick to survive that. I realized I was trapped not just by circumstances, but by love. My love for my family would force me to marry a man who might be dangerous, maybe even a murderer. That night, I stopped being a girl with options and became a woman with impossible burdens. As I watched Wesley limp away into the darkness, I felt something in me die. Not my spirit exactly, but my innocence, my faith that good things happen to good people and that love conquers all. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at those bank papers and trying to understand how my life had become a chess game where I was just a pawn. Dr. Montgomery hadn't chosen me out of love, not even for beauty. He had chosen me because he could, because I came with a price my father was desperate enough to accept. But the most terrifying realization came as the sun began to filter through our kitchen window. If Dr. Montgomery had been willing to have Wesley beaten just for talking to me, what would he do to me once I was legally his wife, alone in his house with no witnesses or protection? I understood then that my wedding night wouldn't be about consummating a marriage, but about establishing ownership. And whatever had happened to Vivian, whatever had made her risk everything to flee from him, would probably happen to me too. With 8 hours left before the wedding, I finally understood I wasn't walking toward a new life, but toward something that could destroy me completely. And there wasn't a soul in the world who could save me. Sitting there, watching the sunrise on what might be my last day of freedom, I made myself a Moors. Whatever Dr. Ezekiel Montgomery had planned for me, whatever dark secrets he was hiding, I was going to survive it. Somehow I would find my way through whatever was coming and find my way back to the light. I had no idea how much darkness I would have to cross first, nor that the greatest surprise of my life was waiting on the other side of those vows. The ceremony passed like a feverish dream. I remember walking down the aisle of the small white church in Willow Creek wearing Mama's modified wedding dress, feeling like I was floating outside my own body watching another girl marry a stranger. Montgomery stood at the altar in his best black suit, and when I reached him, he took my trembling hand in his steady one, with what looked like satisfaction in those pale blue eyes. Pastor Williams spoke about love, devotion, and honoring your husband, but all I could think about was Wesley's bloodied face and the stain on his shirt. When it came time to say my vows, my voice came out so low that the people in the back had to lean forward to hear me. Montgomery's voice, in contrast, rang out clear and strong, as if he were proclaiming a victory rather than taking a wife. The reception was held in the church community hall. I sat at the head table, picking at a piece of cake that tasted like sawdust. Dr. Montgomery kept his hand on my knee the entire time, pressing through the fabric of my dress, as if to remind me that I now belonged to him. Each time someone came to congratulate us, he squeezed a little harder, and I had to stop myself from pulling away. When it was time to leave for his house, My new home, Dr. Montgomery helped me into his lack Cadillac with a gentleness that might have fooled anyone, but I could feel the tension in his grip, the contained excitement that turned my stomach. The drive to his estate in Willow Creek County took nearly an hour. We didn't speak during the journey. He hummed that same melody I'd heard before, and I stared out the window at the Tennessee landscape, thinking this might be the last time I saw the world from a relatively safe position. His house was larger than I had imagined, a two-story white mansion with a porch that wrapped around the structure and shutters that needed paint. But there was something unwelcoming about it, something that made it feel more like a prison than a home. Perhaps it was the way the windows seemed to stare at us like empty eyes, or how the entire property sat isolated on a hilltop with no neighboring houses in sight. Dr. Montgomery carried my small suitcase to the door, and opening it, I was hit by the smell. That same medicinal odor I had noticed on him, but stronger, mixed with something damp and old. He showed me the rooms on the ground floor, his hand always at the small of my back, pointing out the parlor, dining room, and kitchen, as if giving a tour to a visitor, not showing his new wife her home. Then he led me upstairs to what would be our bedroom. That's when reality hit me like a punch to the gut. The room was large, dominated by a four-poster bed that took up half the space. Heavy curtains blocked most of the evening light, making everything feel oppressive. Dr. Montgomery closed the door behind us with a soft click that sounded as final as a coffin lid. When he looked at me, all the courtesy he had shown in front of my family was gone, replaced by something raw and hungry that made me want to run. He told me to sit on the bed while he prepared himself. I perched on the edge of the mattress like a bird about to take flight. My hands were shaking so badly I had to lace them in my lap to keep them still. I could hear his movements behind me, the rustle of clothing falling, and my heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst from my chest. When I turned around, what I saw left me breathless. Dr. Ezekiel Montgomery was built like no man I had ever seen or even imagined. The sight of him unclothed was so shocking, so overwhelming, that I let out a gasp and backed up until I hit the headboard. He was enormous in a way that seemed almost inhuman, and the expression on his face at noticing my reaction was one of dark satisfaction, as if my fear was exactly what he expected. But it wasn't just his physical presence that terrified me, it was the way he looked at me, like something he had been waiting a long time to possess. He approached the bed slowly, deliberately, and I knew that everything I had feared was about to become reality. What happened next lasted what seemed like hours, but were probably minutes. The pain was like nothing I had experienced before. Sharp, tearing, absolute. I bit my lip so hard. I made it bleed to keep from screaming, but some sounds escaped me, whimpers, gasps that seemed to excite rather than concern him. Dr. Montgomery seemed to particularly enjoy my suffering, whispering things in my ear that turned my stomach and filled me with shame. He told me this was what I was made for, what I belonged to him for, and that I'd better get used to it because this would be my life from now on. When he finished, I felt something inside me had broken beyond repair. He turned over and fell asleep within minutes, snoring softly as if what had occurred was the most natural thing in the world. I remained awake all night, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how I was going to survive this. My whole body ached, but the worst pain was in my heart, knowing that this was just the beginning, that my life would be night after night with a man who saw me as property to use at his whim. But as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the heavy curtains, I made myself a new promise. I would find a way to endure this, to survive whatever Dr. Montgomery planned to do to me. I wouldn't let him break me completely, no matter how hard he tried. What I didn't know was that the worst was yet to come, and that before the week was out, I would discover something about my new husband that would make everything I'd already experienced seem like a gentle introduction to the real horror. The first week of marriage taught me things about fear I had never imagined. Dr. Montgomery had a routine, and I learned quickly that altering it brought consequences I wasn't prepared for. He rose before dawn, dressed in silence, and expected breakfast to be ready when he came downstairs. Black coffee, eggs fried without breaking the yolk, bacon crisp but not burnt. If anything was even slightly wrong, his mood darkened like storm clouds rolling in. But it wasn't just the perfectionist demands that wore me down, it was the way he constantly watched me, as if studying me for something. He would sit in his armchair after dinner, newspaper in hand, but with his eyes following my every movement as I cleaned the kitchen. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with a strange expression, almost confused, as if he were seeing someone else entirely. The house itself felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite describe. During the day, when Dr. Montgomery went out to see patients, the silence was so deep it seemed like I wasn't alone, like something was listening from the corner. The medicinal smell was strongest in our bedroom, but I found traces of it throughout the house, in the closets, behind doors, in places where it shouldn't be. It was Miss Ruthie May, the colored woman who came twice a week to help with the heavy cleaning, who made me understand I wasn't losing my mind. Ruthie May had worked for Dr. Montgomery for almost 15 years, since before his first wife, Vivian, had supposedly left, and she knew things about that house that nobody else did. She was a small, tired woman with graying hair always pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that miss nothing. She moved through the house like someone who had learned to be invisible, speaking only when spoken to, but I could feel her watching me with a mixture of pity and something else, recognition. It must have been in my second week in that house when Ruthie May finally broke her silence. Dr. Montgomery had gone into town for supplies, and I was in the kitchen trying to remove a stain from one of his shirts. When Ruthie May appeared at my side with a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for, she set it on the counter and stood there a moment, as if deciding something important. Then she looked directly into my eyes for the first time since I'd arrived, and spoke in a whisper barely above a breath. She told me Vivian used to have the same bruises I was trying to hide with long sleeves and high collars. Vivian had also been young when she married Dr. Montgomery, perhaps 19 or 20, and at first she had tried to cope just like I was doing. But then Ruthie May said something that froze my blood. Vivian hadn't been Dr. Montgomery's only wife. There had been another years before, a young woman named Lucille, who lasted less than a year before disappearing one winter night. People assumed she had run away, but Ruthie May had her suspicions. Her hands trembled as she told me this, and I knew she was risking something just by talking to me. She explained that Dr. Montgomery had a way of becoming attached to his young wives, but that attachment wasn't love, it was pure possession. And when that possession was threatened, or when his wives tried to have any independence, things turned dangerous very quickly. Ruthie May warned me to be careful about mentioning my family or my life before, because Dr. Montgomery didn't like to be reminded that his wives had existed before him. She said Vivian made that mistake by talking about her sister in Memphis, who kept sending letters, and from then on, everything started to get worse. But the most chilling thing she told me was about the barn. Dr. Montgomery always kept it locked, and sometimes at night there were sounds coming from there. Not animal sounds, but something else. Something that raised the hair on her neck. She had asked him about it once, years ago, and he had gotten so angry that she never mentioned it again. That day, as she left, Ruthie May pressed something into my hand, a small brass key, warm from her palm. She told me it was a spare key to the back door, and if I ever needed to get out quickly, I should look for it under a loose board on the back porch steps, the third one from the top. When she was gone, I stood in the empty kitchen, holding that key and trying to process what she had told me. If there had been other wives who hadn't left but had disappeared, then what I had wasn't just an abusive husband, but something much more sinister. That night, Dr. Montgomery returned from town in a very good mood, whistling that same melody as always, and bringing me a bag of peppermint sticks from the general store. But instead of feeling grateful for the gesture, I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of the darkness Ruthie May had warned me about. As he read the newspaper after dinner, I noticed something I had overlooked before. A ring of keys hung from his belt, and one of them was different, older and more ornate, as if it belonged to something important. When I asked about it, trying to sound casual, his entire body went rigid. He told me it was the key to his office in the barn, where he kept his important documents, and that I should never go near it. He didn't say it as a request or even an order, but as a threat. In that soft, controlled voice, I was learning to fear more than shouting. But I saw the fear in his eyes when I asked about that key, and I knew that whatever he kept in there wasn't just papers. Something was locked in that barn office, something he was desperate to keep secret, and I had a feeling it had to do with the other wives Ruthie May had mentioned. That night, lying beside Dr. Montgomery and listening to his steady breathing, I understood I wasn't just trapped in a bad marriage, but in something much worse. And if I ever wanted to see my family again, I would need to be smarter and more careful than ever. The question was whether I would discover his secrets before he destroyed me, or if I would end up as just another young wife who disappeared in the hills of Tennessee, leaving only rumors and unanswered questions. 3 weeks after my wedding, I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew. It all started with a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning while Dr. Montgomery was fixing fences in the far pasture. The mailman, old Mr. Pittman, handed it to me with a curious look, probably wondering who would be writing to Mrs. Ezekiel Montgomery so soon after the wedding. The envelope bore careful handwriting, and as I opened it, my hands trembled so badly, I nearly dropped it. It was from Vivian, Dr. Montgomery's first wife, the one who had supposedly run off years ago. But she wasn't writing from some distant city to tell me about her new life. She was writing from Willow Creek County Hospital. The words in that letter turned my world upside down. Vivian explained that she had been in hiding for the past 5 years, protected by people who believed her story. According to her letter, she hadn't run away as everyone thought. She had been forced to flee for her life. When Dr. Montgomery discovered her trying to leave him, he had flown into a rage unlike anything she had ever seen. He had beaten her so badly she thought she would die, and he would have finished the job if Ruthie May hadn't intervened, creating a distraction that allowed Vivian to escape through a window. The most terrifying part of her letter was the warning she gave me. She said Dr. Montgomery had a pattern, a sickness that made him obsess over young wives, but that obsession always turned dangerous when they showed independence or tried to maintain contact with their previous life. She had tried to stay in touch with her sister after marrying him, and that was when he started to change, becoming more controlling and violent by the day. Vivian revealed something else that made me feel cold in the pit of my stomach. Dr. Montgomery had shown her photographs of Lucille, the wife before her, pictures that proved Lucille hadn't left as everyone believed. Dr. Montgomery kept those photos in a tin box hidden somewhere in the house, images that showed what really happened to wives who tried to leave him. She begged me to be careful, not to let Dr. Montgomery know I had received her letter, and to watch for signs that he might be planning to do to me what he had done to them. According to Vivian, the process was simple but devastating. First came isolation, then accusations, then the punishments, and finally, for those who still resisted, the barn. I burned the letter in the kitchen stove, but her words echoed in my head for days. Every time Dr. Montgomery looked at me strangely, every time he made one of his odd comments about my behavior, I wondered if he was building a case against me, preparing for whatever he had done to Vivian and Lucille. The Saturday after that letter arrived, I found the tin box Vivian had mentioned. Dr. Montgomery had gone to town for his monthly meeting with the medical board, a trip that normally kept him away most of the day. I was cleaning our bedroom when I noticed one of the floorboards near the window creaked differently than the others. Looking at it more closely, I realized it was loose. When I lifted it, I discovered a small space underneath, just big enough for a tin box about the size of a cigar case. My hands shook as I took it out and opened the lid, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found inside. There were photographs, just as Vivian had said, but they weren't just pictures of Lucille. There were photos of me, dozens of them, taken without my knowledge in the weeks before our wedding, hanging laundry at my parents' house, walking to church, sitting under the oak tree where I used to meet Wesley. Montgomery had been watching me long before I realized, studying me like a specimen. But it was the photos of Lucille that made me drop the box and scramble backward across the floor. They showed a young woman with blonde hair and frightened eyes. She wasn't posing for these photographs. Some showed her tied to a chair in what looked like a cellar. Others showed her in various states of undress and obvious distress. The final photograph showed her still and pale on what appeared to be a wooden table, with her eyes closed and her skin having an unnatural, waxy appearance. Among the photos were newspaper clippings about missing women from neighboring counties, cases that had occurred over the past 20 years. Some were wives who had supposedly run away from their husbands, others young women who had simply vanished without a trace. Montgomery had kept these clippings like trophies and written notes in the margins about the similarities he found between the missing women and his own wives. At the bottom of the box was a journal, written in Dr. Montgomery's careful hand. The entries went back 15 years and detailed his observations about his wives' behavior, their attempts to assert independence, and the methods he used to correct them. The most recent entries were about me, describing my reactions in different situations and rating my level of obedience as if I were part of an experiment. One entry, dated just 3 days before our wedding, chilled my blood. Dr. Montgomery wrote about his plans for our marriage, how he intended to isolate me gradually from my family and then begin the process of reshaping me once I had served his immediate purpose. He mentioned how the barn had been useful for training Lucille and that he was considering whether it would be necessary to use it with me. I carefully put everything back exactly as I had found it and replaced the floorboard. I knew I was running out of time. Montgomery wasn't just an abusive husband, he was something much worse, someone who had spent decades perfecting his techniques for harming women, and I was just the latest in a long line of victims he had selected and groomed for his form of torture. That night, as he read the newspaper after dinner, I observed him with new eyes. Every time he glanced at me, every casual comment about my day or my behavior, I heard the echo of those journal entries. He was studying me, documenting my responses, preparing for the next phase of the nightmare he had planned. The worst part was pretending everything was normal, continuing to cook his meals, clean his house, and yield to his demands while knowing what he truly was. But I also knew that my survival depended on not letting him notice any change, not giving him any reason to suspect I had discovered his secrets. That night, as I lay in bed listening to his breathing and feeling the weight of his arm across me, I understood I was living on borrowed time. Very soon, Dr. Montgomery would decide I was no longer useful as an obedient wife and move on to the next phase of his plan. The question was whether I could find a way to escape before that happened, or if I was destined to end up like Lucille, just another collection of photographs in a tin box hidden under the floorboards. October came early that year, bringing with it a cold snap that made the house feel even more like a gnome. In the past few days, Dr. Montgomery had been watching me more closely, and I could feel the shift in his interest like a change in the weather. He had started asking strange questions about my family, if I missed them, if I ever thought about visiting them. Each question seemed like a trap, and I tried to answer in ways that wouldn't trigger whatever he was planning. It was on a Thursday night, exactly 6 weeks after our wedding, when everything came to a head. During dinner, he was unusually quiet, picking at his food and shooting me furtive glances when he thought I wouldn't notice. After I finished washing the dishes, he asked me to join him in the parlor, using that careful, controlled voice that always raised goosebumps on my skin. He had placed 2 chairs in front of the fireplace, facing each other. When I sat down, he positioned himself so close our knees nearly touched. His eyes, that pale blue, had a strange intensity I had never seen before. And when he began to speak, his voice had a hypnotic quality that reminded me of a snake charmer. He started by telling me how much I meant to our marriage, how grateful he was to have found someone as young and pure as me to share his life. But there was something unsettling about the way he said it, as if he were reciting lines from a play he had performed many times before. His hands moved constantly as he spoke, adjusting his shirt cuffs, smoothing his hair, touching the ornate key that hung from his belt. Then he began asking me about my dreams, whether I was sleeping well, if I had noticed any changes in my mood or behavior. The questions seemed innocent, but I remembered Vivian's warning about how Dr. Montgomery built a case against his wives, and I realized this might be the beginning of that process. I told him I slept fine, that I felt perfectly normal, but as the words left my mouth, I could see him mentally filing away each answer for future use. He nodded thoughtfully after each reply, sometimes making small sounds, as if evaluating something important. That's when he brought out the photograph. These weren't from the tin box. These were different, older, and showed women I didn't recognize. Dr. Montgomery spread them across the small table between our chairs as if dealing cards. His movements were deliberate and calculated. Each photograph showed a young woman, and they all had that same haunted look I had begun to see in my own reflection. Dr. Montgomery explained they were women he had known over the years, women who suffered from what he called nervous conditions that required special treatment. He spoke about each one as if discussing the weather, describing their symptoms and the methods that had been used to help them. But the way he touched each photograph, the satisfaction in his voice when he talked about their treatments, made it clear that helping these women hadn't been his true motivation. There was one photo in particular that caught my attention. A dark-haired young woman with terrified eyes who seemed strangely familiar. When I asked Dr. Montgomery about her, his demeanor changed completely. His calculated composure cracked just for an instant, and I saw something raw and hungry flash across his face. He told me her name was Abigail and that she had been what he called a special case. She required more intensive treatment than the others, treatment that had been carried out in a private facility he himself had built specifically for that purpose. The way he pronounced private facility turned my stomach because I had the terrible certainty that I knew exactly what he was referring to. Dr. Montgomery collected the photographs and put them away, but not before I noticed that Abigail's went into a different pile than the rest. When I asked what made her case so special, he smiled at me in a way that set off all my alarms. He explained that Abigail had been particularly resistant to conventional treatment, that she had required what he called environmental therapy in a controlled setting. He had to design special accommodations for her, a place where she could be monitored and treated without the distractions of the outside world. Then he stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the barn that stood about 150 feet from the house. In the growing dusk, I could see a faint light on in one of the upper windows, a light I had never noticed before. Montgomery followed my gaze and nodded, pleased that I had finally seen it. He told me he still maintained his treatment facility, that it was important to be prepared for special cases that might present themselves. The way he looked at me as he said it left no doubt. The facility was for me, and he was already planning when he would need to use it. But then he said something that froze my blood. He mentioned that he had received news that very day about my old friend Wesley Thorne, that there had been an accident at the Hawkins farm. Wesley had been found unconscious in one of the stables, severely injured, and was in the town hospital. The doctors weren't sure if he would recover, Dr. Montgomery said, but it was a real shame when young men didn't know to mind their own business. The precise, controlled tone with which he delivered this news was the same he had used to discuss the photographs, and it made clear that Wesley's accident had been nothing of the sort. Montgomery had grown tired of waiting for me to forget my old life, so he decided to eliminate the parts of it that still meant something to me. As we sat there in the flickering firelight, with Dr. Montgomery watching me digest the news about Wesley, I understood that everything was accelerating much faster than I had anticipated. He wasn't planning to wait months or even weeks to move to the next phase of his plan. He was preparing to use his treatment facility very soon, perhaps in a matter of days. The light in the barn window seemed to pulse in the darkness like a heartbeat or a warning signal. Whatever was in that building, whatever Montgomery had prepared for me, was ready and waiting, and from the way he kept shifting his gaze between me and that distant light, I knew my time was running out faster than sand in an hourglass. That night, as I lay rigid beside Dr. Montgomery, feeling his satisfaction radiating like heat from a stove, I knew everything was about to change. The careful game we had been playing was nearly over, and soon I would discover exactly what had happened to Abigail, to Lucille, and to all those other women in the photographs. The only question was whether I would live long enough to tell about it, or if I would end up just another image in Dr. Montgomery's collection, another success story in his private journal of women who required his brand of treatment. And the next morning I would discover that my worst fears were barely the beginning of what Dr. Ezekiel Mainbourne had planned for me. I woke on Friday to the sound of Dr. Montgomery moving about the room earlier than usual. When I opened my eyes, I saw him standing at the foot of the bed, fully dressed, holding a cup of coffee and watching me with an expression I had never seen on him before. It wasn't anger, nor the cold calculation I had grown accustomed to. It was anticipation, like a child on Christmas morning who knows exactly what gift awaits him under the tree. He told me he had special plans for the day, that we were going to tour his property so I could better understand the full scope of what he had built over the years. The way he said full scope raised the hairs on my skin, because I knew he wasn't talking about livestock or crops. He was talking about the barn, about what awaited me in that building with the lighted window. Dr. Montgomery prepared breakfast himself, something he had never done before, and watched me eat every bite with an intensity that constricted my throat. The eggs tasted like sawdust, and the coffee was bitter, but I forced myself to swallow it all because I knew it might be my last real meal for a very long time. After breakfast, he led me outside into the crisp October air, holding my elbow firmly as if escorting a prisoner. We walked slowly across the yard toward the barn, and with each step I felt my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The morning mist still rose from the fields, making everything look ghostly and unreal. Dr. Montgomery talked as we walked, using the tone of a tour guide showing off his most prized achievement. He explained how he had designed the barn himself, how he had insisted on certain modifications that weren't usual in agricultural construction. He had built it with extra thick walls to insulate sound, he said, and with special ventilation systems to maintain air quality in any weather. When we reached the doors, he took out the ornate key from his belt and unlocked them with an almost ceremonial care. The hinges creaked as they swung open, revealing an interior unlike any barn I had ever seen. The ground floor was divided into several rooms with actual walls and doors, and there was electrical wiring running across the ceiling, unusual for farm buildings in the area. But what made my legs tremble were the stairs leading to the upper level, solid, wooden, but sturdy, rising up to what Dr. Montgomery called his special project rooms. He guided me toward them with a gentle pressure on my back, and I knew that what awaited me upstairs would change everything. The upper floor had been transformed into a cross between a medical facility and a prison. There were several small rooms with heavy doors, each with a viewing window and what looked like ventilation grills. Montgomery showed me the first one with evident pride, explaining how he had designed it to ensure maximum security while maintaining what he called humane living conditions. It was the largest room at the end of the hallway, where I truly understood the magnitude of his madness. It was set up like a makeshift hospital room, with restraints attached to a metal table and cabinets full of medical supplies. Montgomery explained that this was where he conducted his most important research, studying the effects of isolation and controlled environments on the female mind. He spoke of his work as if it were legitimate scientific research, describing how he documented psychological changes in his subjects over time. He showed me charts and tables of what he called behavioral modifications and photographs documenting the physical effects of his treatments. Seeing those images, witnessing the deterioration of healthy young women into empty, lifeless shells, I understood I was looking at the trophy collection of a serial killer. That's when Dr. Montgomery revealed the most terrifying truth. His first wife, Lucille, was still alive. She was in the smallest room at the end of the hallway, and she had been his guest for almost 20 years. What everyone believed had been her disappearance had actually been her transition to becoming his permanent research subject. He opened the door to show her to me, and what I saw in that room will haunt me until the day I die. Lucille sat on a narrow cot, staring at the wall with vacant eyes that didn't register our presence. She had aged decades since her wedding photo. Her blonde hair was now completely gray, and her body so thin it looked fragile. She was alive, but everything that made her human had been systematically destroyed. Dr. Montgomery said Lucille represented his greatest success, a complete transformation from willful young woman to perfectly obedient subject. It had taken him 3 years to achieve the result he wanted, but he assured me it had been worth it. Lucille no longer remembered her life before captivity. She had no desires, opinions, or thoughts beyond the basic need to survive. Looking at her, I understood that this would be my future too. Not death, but something far worse. Dr. Montgomery planned to keep me alive for decades, studying me, documenting my breakdown, perfecting his methods for destroying the human spirit. I would be his next great success, another example of what could be achieved with enough time and the right methods. But as Dr. Montgomery continued his tour, showing me other rooms and explaining his plan for my treatment, something inside me changed. Perhaps it was seeing Lucille and understanding that death would be an act of mercy compared to what awaited me. Or perhaps it was the anger that had been building for weeks, finally breaking through the barrier of fear. I decided I would not become another Lucille, another broken doll in Dr. Montgomery's collection. I was going to fight even if it cost me my life. I would rather die as Hazel Blackwood than live as Dr. Montgomery's perfect subject. The question was how to confront a man who had spent 20 years perfecting his methods, who controlled every aspect of my environment, and who had the law on his side. But as we headed back to the house and Dr. Montgomery continued talking about his research and his plans for me, I began to formulate a plan. It would be dangerous, probably suicidal, but it was the only chance I had to avoid Lucille's fate. And if I failed, if Dr. Montgomery caught me before I could escape or get help, at least I would fall fighting and not slowly fade away in one of those horrible rooms. That night, I decided I would act. Tomorrow might be too late. I would rather stake everything on one desperate gamble than spend the next 20 years watching my soul die piece by piece in Dr. Montgomery's private hell. The only doubt was whether I would have the courage to go through with it when the moment came, or if I would lose my nerve and condemn myself to becoming just another entry in his research journals. That night, I waited until Dr. Montgomery's breathing became deep and steady, the sign that he was asleep. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would wake him. I slid out of bed inch by inch, making sure the mattress didn't creak. The floorboards were my greatest enemy. After weeks of observation, I knew exactly which ones squeaked. I had hidden Ruthie Mae's spare key in my slipper during the day, and I now retrieved it with hands that trembled so badly I nearly dropped it twice. My plan was simple but desperate. Get to the barn, find evidence of what Montgomery did to those women, and somehow make it to town before he discovered my absence. The sheriff might not believe me, but physical evidence would be harder to ignore. The October night was freezing, and I didn't dare take a coat for fear of waking him. I crossed the yard in my nightgown with bare feet, feeling the frosted grass cut into my soles like tiny blades. The barn loomed before me like a monument to evil, but I forced myself to move forward. Using the key I had stolen from Dr. Montgomery's belt while he slept, I unlocked the doors and slipped inside. The darkness was absolute, but I had brought matches from the kitchen and managed to light one without burning my fingers. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls as I moved toward the stairs, each silhouette seeming like that of Dr. Montgomery, ready to drag me back. I climbed the steps like one ascending to their own execution, each one bringing me closer to the evidence I needed, but also to the heart of Dr. Montgomery's madness. The upper floor was even more eerie in the flickering light. The medical equipment cast grotesque shadows, and the closed doors hid unspeakable secrets. When I reached Lucille's room, my plan fell apart. The door was open, and she wasn't sitting on the cot as she had been that morning. She was standing in the doorway. When the match light illuminated her face, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before: awareness, recognition, and perhaps hope. She spoke to me in a voice like dry leaves in the wind, so low I had to strain to hear her. She said she had been waiting for someone like me, young and strong, capable of doing what needed to be done. She confessed that she had been pretending to be broken for years, waiting for the right moment and the right person to end Dr. Montgomery's reign of terror. Lucille told me she had discovered something I didn't know. Dr. Montgomery wasn't just keeping women in the barn for his experiments, he was also selling them. There was a network of men like him, wealthy and connected, who traded in what they called special subjects. Some of the women in the photographs weren't just victims of his experiments, but merchandise sold to other collectors when Dr. Montgomery grew bored with them. She led me to a hidden compartment in the wall of her room that she had excavated over years with a spoon stolen from her meal tray. Inside were documents, letters, and photographs proving that Dr. Montgomery was part of something much larger and more organized than I had imagined. There were shipping records, payment receipts, and correspondence with men from other states who shared his interests. But the most damning proof was a ledger with records of every woman who had passed through that barn in the last 20 years. Some were marked as retained for research, others as transferred to associates, and a few simply as disposed. Seeing my name at the end of the most recent page, next to a notation about my estimated breaking time and potential resale value, turned my stomach. Lucille told me there was more evidence hidden throughout the barn: photographs, documents, and even recordings of sessions Dr. Montgomery had conducted with various women. She had been collecting them for years, waiting for someone who could help her get them to the authorities. But she also warned me that Dr. Montgomery had allies in town, men who knew about his activities and protected him in exchange for certain considerations. That's when we heard the sound that froze my blood, the barn doors creaking open on the floor below. Dr. Montgomery had discovered I was gone and was coming for me. Lucille grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me toward the back of the barn, where she showed me a window that could be opened from the inside. She had planned her own escape for years, but had never had the courage to take the final step. Now, with my arrival, she finally saw her opportunity. But as we were about to climb through that window, Dr. Montgomery's voice filtered up from the main floor, and what he said left us frozen. He wasn't alone. There were other voices, other men who had come to help him with what he called his domestic situation. Lucille told me those voices belonged to men who had previously purchased women from Dr. Montgomery, men who had as much to lose as he did if their operation came to light. We were trapped in that barn with evidence of decades of unspeakable crimes and surrounded by the very men who had participated in them. Getting out alive seemed impossible. But Lucille looked at me with eyes that, after 20 years of darkness, had regained their fire. She told me she had something else hidden in her room, something she had saved for this exact moment, a can of kerosene and a box of matches. It wasn't much, but enough to destroy the evidence if we couldn't escape with it. At least then, other women might be spared our fate. As footsteps on the stairs grew closer and Dr. Montgomery's voice called my name with false sweetness, Lucille and I made our decision. If we couldn't live as free women, at least we could die ensuring no one else would suffer in that place. But just as Lucille struck the first match, something happened that neither of us expected. Something that would change everything and give us a chance we thought was forever lost. The sound of sirens filled the night, drawing closer and closer. Dr. Montgomery's confident voice turned to panic as he realized his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. But it wasn't the sirens that saved us that night. It was something much more unexpected and miraculous than I could ever have imagined. As Lucille held that lit match and we prepared to burn along with 20 years of evidence, Dr. Montgomery appeared at the top of the stairs accompanied by two men I didn't recognize, but instead of the cold, calculating monster I had lived with for weeks, I saw on his face something that left me stunned, genuine terror and almost a hint of relief. The men with him weren't there to help him dispose of us. They were FBI agents who had been tracking the human trafficking network for more than 3 years, and Dr. Montgomery had been collaborating with them as an informant for the past 6 months. Everything I had discovered, every piece of evidence Lucille had gathered, Dr. Montgomery had been secretly documenting and turning over to the authorities. It turned out he wasn't the mastermind of that operation, but its most tormented victim. 23 years earlier, those same men had kidnapped his younger brother Jonathan and forced him to watch as they tortured and killed him. Then they threatened to do the same to his parents if he didn't use his farm as a front for their activities. For more than 2 decades, Montgomery had lived trapped in a nightmare, forced to participate in horrors that tore his soul apart piece by piece. The medical equipment, the rooms, even his treatment of Lucille. It had all been an elaborate act to convince the real criminals that he was one of them while he gathered evidence for their eventual arrest. Lucille, in fact, had been aware of everything for the past 10 years, working with Dr. Montgomery and pretending to be his broken victim. When Dr. Montgomery saw the confusion and disbelief in my eyes, he completely broke down. Through tears that seemed to come from the depths of his being, he told me he had tried to protect me by marrying me before the network could target me on their own. He discovered they had been watching me for months, planning to take me anyway, and his marriage proposal to my father had been a desperate attempt to keep me under his protection. The most shocking revelation came when he explained why he had been so strange and distant, as if he were 2 people at once. He confessed that he had been slowly poisoning himself with laudanum for years to numb himself to what he was forced to do, but that he had tried to reduce the dose since our wedding because he wanted his mind clear to protect me. That's when Lucille stepped in with a voice stronger than it had been in years. Everything I had experienced in our bedroom, all the pain and fear Dr. Montgomery had caused me, had been as agonizing for him as it was for me. She said she had seen him vomit after our wedding night, pray and cry, begging God for forgiveness for what he was forced to do to an innocent girl. The FBI agents explained that they had finally gathered enough evidence to arrest the entire network, but that Dr. Montgomery had to maintain his cover until the last moment. My escape attempt that night was actually what triggered the final raid. Montgomery had alerted them when he discovered I was gone, knowing the operation was about to be exposed anyway. By dawn, I watched as dozens of agents led away in handcuffs the men who had terrorized Dr. Montgomery and countless women for decades. The barn was dismantled piece by piece, every document and photograph cataloged as evidence in what would become one of the largest human trafficking trials in state history. But the most incredible part of this impossible story was what happened afterward. Dr. Montgomery, finally free from the burden he had carried for more than 20 years, became the man he was always meant to be. The cold, calculating face that had terrified me disappeared, and in its place was someone kind, broken, desperate to atone for what he had been forced to do. He insisted on divorcing me immediately, saying that what had been done to me in his name was unforgivable, even if it had been under coercion. He bought me a small house in town and gave me enough money to live independently while I decided what to do with my life. When Wesley Thorn recovered from his injuries, actually inflicted by the trafficking network when they discovered he was asking too many questions about my marriage, Dr. Montgomery personally apologized to him and gave his blessing for us to be together. The legal proceedings lasted 3 years, during which Dr. Montgomery rebuilt his shattered soul with the help of Pastor Williams and the forgiveness of a community that gradually understood he had been as much a victim as anyone else. And it was during those 3 years that the most beautiful thing happened. Vivian came home. She hadn't been in the county hospital all those years, but had actually been in protective custody, working with the same federal agents who had been building the case. When she finally returned to Tennessee, she and Dr. Montgomery, whose real name was Ezekiel Garrison, found healing together in a way that seemed impossible but proved to be exactly what they both needed. At 25, I married Wesley Thorn in the same small church where I had once thought my life was ending. We built the family we had dreamed about under that old oak tree. We had beautiful children who grew up knowing the truth about courage, forgiveness, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wound. Dr. Montgomery and Vivian lived together for 20 years of peace after that. And when he passed away at 72, he died knowing that God had used even his darkest moments for good. He had saved dozens of women by maintaining his facade, and his testimony helped convict some of the most dangerous predators in the region. Today, at 72, with 9 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren who fill my house with laughter every Sunday, I look back at that terrible time and see God's hand in every moment. Even in our darkest valleys, even when we cannot see beyond our own pain and fear, the Lord is working all things for good. If you're facing something that seems impossible to survive, something you feel might destroy you completely, I want you to remember my story. Remember that appearances deceive, that people aren't always what they seem, and that sometimes what appears to be your destruction might actually be your salvation in disguise. I'm still here in this little house in Mapleton, still telling my story to anyone who needs to hear it. And I'd like to know where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far my words are traveling, where they might be bringing hope to someone who needs it most. If this old woman's tale has touched your heart, perhaps you can help my voice travel even further, find its way to other souls who need to know that no situation is hopeless, that there is no darkness so deep that the light of God cannot penetrate it. Share my story, listen for more like it, because, honey, I have a lifetime of tales about the power of love to overcome even the most impossible circumstances, and believe me, if I could survive what I lived through and come out stronger on the other side, then whatever you're facing right now doesn't stand a chance against the strength the Lord has placed within you.